Thomas Green here with the Peaceful Parenting Podcast. Hello, Jake.
Hello, Thomas.
On the podcast today, we have Richard Capriola. Richard, welcome.
Thank you. Appreciate spending some time with you guys to talk about this important issue.
Well, that's something we mentioned beforehand. It is a very important issue, but would you like to take a moment and tell the audience a little bit about yourself and what you do?
Yes, thank you. I have been in the mental health and addictions field for over 2 decades. I started out working for a mental health crisis center and working with patients that were sent to us from the emergency room at hospitals, and they would stay with us for a period of time. And I noticed that a lot of the people that were coming to the crisis center had not only a mental health issue that they were struggling with, but also had a substance abuse issue as well. So I went back to the University of Illinois and received a master's degree in addictions counseling. I continued to work at the crisis center for a period of time until I was offered a job at Menninger Clinic in Houston, Texas, which is a large psychiatric hospital. I moved to Houston, to the Houston area, and I worked for Menninger for over a decade, treating both adolescents and adults who have mental health and addictions diagnoses. I retired from Menninger a little over a year ago, and that's when I set about writing this book to be a resource for parents on adolescent substance abuse.
Okay.
Fantastic.
Thank you for the introduction. Jake, did you have any openers that you wanted to go with?
Well, I actually got a copy of your book, Richard.
Thank you.
I bought a copy of The Addicted Child. I got a Kindle version because I spend my whole time looking at computer screens, and so it kind of it's more natural for me than unfortunately. I do love the old-fashioned books, when you have it in your hands and you can dog-ear the pages a bit where you shouldn't, feel slightly naughty. But I'm afraid I've reached the modern world. But I've had a read through. I haven't finished it yet, but it's a great resource. I can already say that it has sections on all sorts of different abuses, and some of the things that I've noticed from it that I guess we can touch upon is about how helpless a parent can feel when a child or a teenager, an adolescent, suffers from this abuse or is using drugs in particular, and there's a raft of feelings around that. I think that's been really interesting for me, because whenever I've seen things about substance abuse and things like that, it's mostly been focused on the person who's suffering abuse. Sometimes there's a sort of a little section perhaps about those around, how it affects those around them. But your book goes into a lot more detail about what it is to be a parent and what to look out for and all sorts. So it's a great resource.
Well, thank you, Jake. I appreciate you taking the time to read the book, and you sort of captured very easily, the reasons why I wrote this book. It is to help parents because, as you noted, so many times the focus is on the adolescent or the adult who is struggling with an addiction, and we often don't recognize that the parent is going through their own struggles. And I wrote this book to be non-technical, down very simple explanation of some major components of substance abuse, like what are the warning signs and how do drugs work in the teen brain and what type of assessments you should get. Because I wanted to provide a roadmap for parents in very simple language that they could read very quickly and walk away from with the idea, okay, I've got this. I feel better prepared now than what I was before. So it's good to hear your feedback that goal seems to have been accomplished.
Yes, absolutely. I haven't yet finished it, so I'm going to finish it. We've got a long weekend coming up, so hopefully I'll get through the whole book in that time.
Great.
Yes, it's very interesting. I think it'd be thoroughly useful for anyone who finds themselves in that situation.
And I intentionally kept it short. It runs a little over 100 pages because I didn't want people to feel like they had to wade through a lot of technical information. I kept the chapters concise, with really not a lot of technical language, so that people like myself, might be able to read that book as a parent or an interested person and very quickly grasp some of the important issues and have some good information.
I wanted to
Definitely.
we touched initially on just spending a little bit of time on prevention, if you don't mind. I know your book caters or is a solution to people who are already in that position. But what would you say the best way for parents to prevent this from happening in the first place?
Well, I think the first thing is to read the book so that you have a firm understanding of what's going on with adolescent substance abuse. The book goes through a number of different street drugs that kids have access to, so it's good just to be aware as a parent as to what's out there. It's also important to know what the warning signs are. So the first thing a parent should do is just become more knowledgeable about this issue of adolescent substance abuse, to become familiar with the drugs and the warning signs. In terms of prevention, I think that the best thing is to, at a very early age or even later, it doesn't matter if your child is 6 or 7 or 8 or 16, 17, 18, you can begin to develop good communication skills with that child. We're very good at listening to people's words when we talk to them, and when we listen to them. We're good at hearing the words, but many times we miss the underlying feelings behind those words. So one thing that we can all do, including parents, is to develop some good solid listening skills, so that when we're listening to our child, we're not hearing just their words, we're hearing the feelings behind those words, and to develop that communication pattern with a child. So if they're struggling with something, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's a conflict at school, maybe it's an issue like anxiety or depression, which often accompanies alcohol and drug use, you have laid that foundation of communication so that the child feels comfortable talking to you about those issues. That's the kind of communication skill that we all can learn, and parents can use to foster a good relationship with their child, which in the long term may be one of the most important preventive measures that you can do as a parent.
Yeah, that certainly makes sense to me. The in your book, you mention things to sort of, I guess, to be aware of, things that might make you draw your attention to the fact that perhaps they are an adolescent child is using substance abuse, and things such as looking out for sort of mood swings, defensiveness, perhaps a change in their peer group, um, things like this. Are these good indicators generally?
Yes, they are good indicators, and my book has warning signs for like alcohol, warning signs for marijuana. There are warning signs for a child that might be developing an eating disorder, or who might be self-harming themselves, because many times an eating disorder or self-injury will accompany a child's use of alcohol and drugs. They sometimes go together. So I have warning signs for those two issues. But as a general rule, what I recommend to parents is pay attention to any changes that you see in your child. Don't assume that the changes are normal adolescent development. They may very well be, but they also may be an indicator of something going on below the surface. For example, you may have a child whose grades have been very good and now they're starting to decline. You may have a child who has been in the past very open, very social, and now starts to become withdrawn and isolated. You may have a child who used to participate in sports, no longer enjoys participating in sports. You may have a child who very often would introduce you to their friends, has now become very secretive about those friends. So those are some examples of warning signs. So as a parent, you should pay attention to any changes that you see in your child's behavior, their physical appearance, their attitude. These might all be indicators that there's something going on below the surface.
I know that I've got a load of questions lined up for you based on what we discussed before. But just before we move on from prevention, have you done any work on the main causes? So I know you mentioned the peer group, a change of peer group, but what, in your view, are the main causes or some of the main causes behind why this would happen?
Well, you mentioned peer groups, and certainly that is an important influence on kids. And some kids will get involved or experiment with drugs because of peer pressure and the peer group that they're hanging around with. Other kids might just use it to experiment, to see what it's like. Maybe they've heard about it, they want to see for themselves. But for many kids, not all kids, but for many kids, what I have found is that there is an underlying psychological reason that's driving them to use a substance to medicate that issue. For example, pretty much almost all of the kids that I worked with who were smoking a lot of marijuana, when I asked them to help me understand why they were smoking marijuana so much, the number one answer that came back was, it helps my anxiety. So there may be, in some cases, a child who is using a substance to medicate an underlying psychological issue like anxiety or depression or some type of trauma or perhaps being bullied. And that's an important thing for parents and for all of us to recognize. Once we dig below the surface of a child's substance use, we may find an underlying psychological issue that that child is using a substance to medicate. And it's important that if that's the case, that it get assessed and it get treated alongside treating the alcohol and drug abuse, so that both issues are treated.
And you would make a distinction, because I think a lot of people use that argument for adults, but you would make a distinction, presumably, between, there's a big difference between a young person using marijuana and a adult, for example.
There may be, but I think also for adults, there are certain adults that are also using a drug, say like marijuana, to manage some intolerable thought or feeling or memory. Human beings, we don't like having intolerable feelings or thoughts or memories, so that when we have them, we're going to find a way to provide some relief. So adults, like kids in many cases, if they have these intolerable feelings, maybe intense anxiety, maybe depression, they may turn to some type of substance to relieve that feeling. So that underlying psychological issue is important to examine for adults as well as adolescents.
Do you find that, when coming back to peer pressure, that a lot of this does start in schools? And of course, you hear a lot about marijuana in particular being a gateway drug, which can lead on to more harmful, harder drugs.
I think peer pressure is a big component of it. I think many kids are first introduced to drugs through their friends or through hearing about it through their friends. So it may not be peer pressure, so to speak, but certainly peer influence may play a big role that causes kids to first be introduced to drugs. And then when they're first introduced, they're going to have, either a positive reaction or a negative reaction. And then if they have a positive reaction, that becomes a stimulus for them to continue using.
And that's where they will presumably start altering their peer group as well at that stage.
Yeah, they tend to then gravitate more to kids who are doing what they're doing. That's true.
Okay.
What would you say is the most concerning drug or trend of drugs that today's teens are using?
Well, teens still continue to gravitate to alcohol and marijuana as the two primary substances that they tend to turn to. But what we're noticing is that in the last few years, at least in the United States, there has been a tremendous increase in what is referred to as vaping a substance, where they will take a substance like marijuana or nicotine. They will use an electronic device like a pen, which then takes that substance and turns it into a vapor, which is inhaled. And there has been in the last 3 years a significant increase in the number of teenagers who have turned to vaping a substance. That has just dramatically increased in the last few years. Um, but alcohol and marijuana, I would say, are still continuing to be the primary drugs. There are some kids who are abusing prescription drugs like Adderall and Ritalin. A small percentage of them still are turning to opiates and things like LSD and cocaine. But certainly the majority of substances, the majority of kids who use substances are using alcohol and marijuana.
And marijuana, using marijuana via the vaping method.
Yes,
So
we're
yeah.
seeing more and more of that in the past few years, that they're using the vaping method for their marijuana and for their nicotine as well.
Mm.
Well, both are not ideal, obviously, but is it vaping is considered worse than the typical way of consuming that?
Well, if you ask kids, about their using a vaping method for nicotine, they're very likely to tell you that they think it's safer than smoking cigarettes. In one respect, they're right, because with vaping, you're not getting 100 or more carcinogens that come along with tobacco when you smoke cigarettes. When you smoke cigarettes, you're getting nicotine, but you're getting a lot of other chemicals mixed in with the nicotine. So kids would say, well, at least with the vaping of nicotine, I'm not getting all those other chemicals. The problem is that with vaping, people tend to get a higher concentration of nicotine than what they would get through smoking cigarettes, because the burning of the tobacco will burn off a certain percentage of the nicotine. But with vaping, kids and adults are vaping pretty much pure nicotine at higher concentration levels, which makes it more addictive and more harmful. And whether, inhaling a substance into your lungs through vapor just runs the risk of doing some long-term damage.
I don't know, Tom, if you have a question, but I'm just intrigued to know what you can do, what you should do as a parent, if you discover that your child or your adolescent child is experimenting in this way.
That's a great question. I think the first thing you should do is have a conversation with the child to see what information you can get from the child as to why are they using a substance. Now, that's a conversation that's likely to go one of two ways. It's either going to blow up and become a disaster, and the child's going to become argumentative and defensive and maybe walk away, or it may lead to you actually having a good conversation and beginning to understand what's going on with your child. But regardless of how that conversation goes, the next step is to get some assessments done. And I have an entire chapter in my book on the type of assessments that are important, because certainly you need an addictions assessment so that you have a better understanding of what your child has been using, how often they have been using, and what drugs they have been using. And also a diagnosis, an addictions diagnosis. But you need more than that. And my chapter talks about the other assessments that are needed, one of which is a psychological assessment, because you want to know, you want to rule in or rule out whether or not there's a psychological reason that may be driving your child to use that substance. They may not talk about it. They may not tell you that they have a lot of anxiety or that they have a lot of depression, but a psychological or a neuropsychological evaluation will give you that information.
How long would you say it takes for a child to become addicted, or is it very much just based on the amount they do?
Well, it's different for everybody, and you bring up a good point, because so many times we use this term addiction, we use this term addicted, which is not a diagnosis. I point out in my book that your child will not be diagnosed as an addict. That is not a diagnosis. If it's appropriate, your child will be given a diagnosis of what we call a substance use disorder. And that disorder can either be mild or moderate or severe, depending upon the number of negative consequences associated with the use of the drug. As there are more and more negative consequences from the drug use, the diagnosis moves from mild to moderate to severe. So it's important that parents understand that their child is not an addict. Their child is not addicted to a substance. If it's appropriate, they have a substance use disorder, like any other mental health disorder. Um, and a child can become dependent upon a substance, which means that usually their tolerance has increased. They need more and more of the substance to get the feeling that they want. And that's what years ago we used to call addiction, but now we've changed the terminology to reflect that it's more of a disorder than a stigmatizing term like addiction.
I think it could be quite an isolating experience for the parent as well, because they might feel that they don't know where to turn for support, and they might not want to tell their friends and their colleagues and other family members that this is actually going on. So presumably there is still a big stigma around this kind of abuse.
There is a stigma associated with it, and many parents do feel isolated. And you know, when I talk to parents about their child's substance use history, you know, they would look at me and they would say, you know, I had no idea this was going on. Or if they did suspect something was going on, they would say, well, I knew something was going on, but I didn't know it was this bad. And then parents start to feel guilty. You know, how did I miss the warning signs? What did I do wrong? And so they've got their own set of emotions that they're going through at the same time they're trying to deal with everything that's going on with their child. And that led me to develop and write the parent handbook, which accompanies this main book that you have a copy of, because I wanted to provide a brief resource for parents to help them. So it has a number of exercises in the workbook to help parents deal with everything that they're going through. It has some exercises on how to help them with anxiety. It has an exercise that helps them develop these communication skills with their child that we were talking about earlier. So I wanted to prepare this brief workbook that would help parents. The main book educates them. That's the goal, to give them the information and to educate them. The workbook is actually meant to help them process some of the feelings that they're going through.
Is the handbook on the site?
Yes, both the main book and the parent workbook are available through Amazon and can be ordered through the book's website.
What's the website?
Helptheaddictedchild.com.
It's a good website. Whilst we're on the topic of generalized addiction, do you make a distinction or a difference between adult and adolescent addiction?
I do, and I think there are two important differences. The first difference is in brain development. You know, the adolescent brain is still in the process of being developed, whereas the adult brain after age 24, 25, 26 is fully developed. So the first big difference is that the adolescent brain, unlike the adult brain, is still in the process of maturing and developing. So when you introduce drugs into a developing brain, you risk doing more damage, and you risk that child becoming more dependent on the drug. So the first difference is brain development. The second difference is in consequences. Adults who have been who have been abusing substances and are dependent on those substances have often faced catastrophic consequences as a result of their alcohol or the drug use. They may have lost a marriage, they may have lost a job, they may have been incarcerated for a period of time. So those are catastrophic consequences that adults can face as a result of their substance use. Adolescents, on the other hand, have faced very few consequences, certainly very few catastrophic consequences like adults face. Adolescents, their biggest consequence usually is their parents coming down on them or imposing some type of restriction on them. So the second difference is in consequences. Adults usually can oftentimes face catastrophic consequences. Adults sometimes have been incarcerated, like I said, but adolescents have faced very few consequences. So those are two big differences between adult and adolescent addiction.
Yeah, I noticed you have a chapter on brain development,
Yes.
which was very interesting, and yeah, it's an important point that you make about that.
I wanted parents to have a brief introduction in very easily understood language of brain development and how these drugs interact and work within the brain, and that's the purpose of that chapter.
There's a particularly, what would you say, alarming graphic about the earlier the age, the more it impacts the brain. And the reason I say it is because of the emphasis, of course, and also I noticed sort of at least with myself anyway, a little bit of an underlying mild fear about approaching the topic. What would you say to parents, given the importance of the topic, who have that feeling, and how they should continue to read the book and get educated on it?
I would say to them that knowledge is power, and that the more you understand what's in my book, and the more that you understand about adolescent substance abuse, the less fearful I hope you will become, to recognize that, that knowing the warning signs helps you to be better prepared to deal with this issue. Knowing what assessments you can get done helps you to feel better prepared. And knowing what resources and treatment options are out there helps you to feel better prepared. So overall, I think a parent who reads this book and obtains this information hopefully will feel more confident that they understand this issue, and if needed, are better prepared to deal with it. And then reading this book in the chapter on neuroscience, I make the point that our brains have a remarkable capacity to heal themselves. So this is an issue that, as a parent, yes, you need to be concerned about it, but don't become obsessed about it. Don't become paranoid about it. Learn the information, learn the knowledge, and understand that if you intervene, that there is a good chance that you can help your child and your family get past this.
Have you got any thoughts on how COVID has impacted this particular topic?
Yes, COVID has disrupted the lives of not only adolescents, but adults throughout the world. And I think we are just now beginning to see some of the mental health ramifications from all that's been going on over the past year, with adults' lives being disrupted, with adolescents' schooling having been significantly changed, with so many kids now confined to home and dealing with school over the internet. We are beginning to see, and I think we're going to see this for a number of years, the mental health ramifications of COVID, both on adults and adolescents. The Centers for Disease Control in the United States has begun to notice that since the pandemic began, there has been a significant increase in the mental health needs for adolescents. For example, there has been a 24% increase in emergency room visits by adolescents in the past year. who are in need of mental health care. There has been over a 30% increase in teenagers who have who are in urgent need of mental health care. So we are seeing the ramifications of COVID start to show up in the mental health of adolescents and adults. And I think that as kids transition back into the traditional school environment, we may see even more stress on these kids. So certainly mental health has been impacted in significant ways for both adults and adolescents. And we're going to have to deal with that for a number of years. In terms of COVID and addiction, what we're seeing is, and I think you would expect to see this in a certain respect, a significant increase in video gaming by kids who are confined at home. You know, in 2020, last year, in 2020, half of the children and teens, half of them were spending more than 6 hours a day in some type of online activity, whether it's gaming or social activities. That's a 500% increase over 2019. So we're starting to see a correlation between online gaming and depression and anxiety as kids have turned to using online gaming, being confined to home as an escape to numb some of the distress and anxiety that they're going through.
I initially thought that it would actually be positive from this perspective because they're at home more, so you would expect them to not be able to get hold of any type of drugs. But of course, coming back to the causes, if depression and anxiety goes up, then it's more likely that addiction is going to increase.
Yeah, they're going to find some way to get relief from that depression or that anxiety. If it's not alcohol or drugs, it might be through gaming, it might be through developing an eating disorder, it might be through self-injury. It could be any number of ways.
Sounds like a ticking time bomb, unfortunately, especially the addiction to being online and digital, gaming and things, all these kind of things. That's something that I hadn't really considered as much.
Yeah, in many ways, it's a ticking time bomb for adults too, because their lives have been stressed and disrupted as much as kids, and that's why I think we're going to see more mental health services, more mental health help needed for adults as well as adolescents as we move out of this pandemic and get back to some version of life before the pandemic.
Well, we've got into a bit of a gloomy part of the conversation there, but there is help available. There's help from Richard Capriola, and the new book is The Addicted Child, A Parent's Guide to Adolescent Substance Abuse. Richard, have you got anything that we haven't mentioned that you think is particularly important for the audience to know, or that you would like to share?
Yeah, let's sort of wrap this up with a positive point of view, because part of writing the book was to help parents understand not only what goes on with addiction, to tell them what the warning signs are, and to tell them how to proceed if they suspect their child is using a substance, but it's also to give them hope, to realize that there are effective treatment options out there. There is help out there from multiple sources, and that if they encounter a child who's using a substance, the earlier they can intervene, the more likely they are to be able to help their child and their family get through this and have a very positive outcome. There is help out there. Recovery is possible, and they can get through this and come out with a very positive outcome.
Get educated is the
Yes.
is the summary to that. So
Yes.
can you remind us again, where's the best place to find you or to buy the book?
Go to the website, helptheaddictedchild.com, and there you can read book endorsements, you can read book reviews, you can learn more about me, you can order the books. It'll take you directly to the Amazon site where you can order both the book in electronic version or paperback version. If you're a parent and you want to have the parent workbook, you can order that too. And there's also a link where you can contact me.
Okay, Jake, have you got any closing thoughts?
I just think it's if anyone, I don't know. There was one question I had, which is there any time when it would be okay to say, that's all right, it's a phase and they'll just grow out of it on their own? Or should you always take action?
You should always take action, because you never know if it's going to be a phase. You know, it may very well be, but that's a very, very dangerous risk to take. I would say that that a parent ought not to take that risk. That if they suspect any substance abuse, they need to act on that, and they need to get the assessments done so that they have an understanding of what's going on. They have a diagnosis, and if necessary, they have recommendations on treatment. But don't assume that it's a phase, because it may very well not be.
So yeah, there you have it. So you should always act upon it. And your book is an absolutely fantastic resource, which certainly will help people to do that.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And Thomas and Jake, I appreciate your taking the time to talk to me, and your questions and your comments. I think they were very helpful. So thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Richard. For the value, and I'll make sure I bought the book too, so I'll leave a review. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Richard.
Mm-hmm.